Grateful for this opportunity. My wife and I, who wasn't my wife when we started this, were given the opportunity to work on this, on the Bible's impact on civil services. So before I say anything else, I will just read through this text. Even though I say my name is Vishal Mangalwadi, my name is not Vishal Mangalwadi. So please read in context. Okay, I'm just going to read through. Did you know that British colonialism survived for 2 centuries because of the Indian civil services? The Iron Man of India, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who served as India's first Home Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, called the ICS Steel Frame of India and argued that independent India ought to continue this colonial administrative machinery. Welcome to this series entitled The Bible and the Making of Modern India. My name is Vishal Mangalwadi. For decades, I've been researching and writing about the role the Bible has played in creating the modern world. In this session, I shall explain how the Bible reformed the corrupt British East India Company and built a trustworthy system of administration and the police. Initially, the British rulers were as corrupt as many of today's civil servants and police. Most voters believe that many of our politicians use civil servants to loot our tax money and to extract bribes from helpless citizens. In some states, they are also using the police, courts, and civil servants to persecute political opponents, free press, and religious minorities. For that reason, some viewers may find it hard to understand why India's first Home Minister called the colonial civil servants the steel frame of justice and fairness that held India together. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel fought against the British Raj, but complemented colonial civil servants prior to India's independence. To be precise, on 21st April 1947 in the Metcalfe House in Delhi, it was Patel who had argued that after independence, the Indian civil services created to keep India as a colony ought to continue serving the independent India. Only its name was changed from ICS to IAS, Indian Administrative Services. Patel's phrase, the steel frame, came from a 1922 speech by the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Management guru Peter Drucker described the colonial civil services as a model for public administration and management. Many of its staff were sons of British pastors. Their parents in churches prayed that these young men would serve India with diligence and integrity. Their prayers were answered. Tucker does not defend colonialism. He agrees that the British Raj was marked by muddled policies, indecision, misdirection, and failures. It survived for as long as it did only because the Bible based evangelical movement built the Indian civil services, as we shall see. Drucker calls the ICS Britain's supreme administrative accomplishment. Quote, the civil servants were younger sons of poor country parsons with no prospects at home and little standing in English society. Their pay was low, and such opportunities for loot or gain as their predecessors had enjoyed in the swashbuckling days of the East India Company 100 years earlier had, by 1860, been eliminated by both law and custom. These untrained, not very bright, and totally inexperienced youngsters ran districts comparable in size and population to small European countries. And they ran them practically all by themselves with a minimum of direction and supervision from the top. Some, of course, became casualties and broke under the strain, falling victim to alcohol, to native women, or the greatest danger of them all, to sloth. But most of them did what they were expected to do and did it reasonably well. They gave India, for the first time in its long and tragic history, peace, a measure of freedom from famine, and a little security of life, worship, and property. They administered justice impartially and, at least as far as they themselves were concerned, honestly and without corruption. They collected taxes, by and large, impartially and equitably. They did not make policy, and in the end, they foundered because they had none. Floundered because they had none. But they administered and administered well. Robert Clive, who was a clerk in the Madras office of the East India Company, later on laid the foundations of the British Raj in 1757 by defeating Bengal's Nawab or ruler Siraj-ud-Daulah. Clive supported the appointment of the new Nawab, Mir Qasim, who ruled until 1763. In 1762, Mir Qasim described British corruption in a letter to the governor and his council. Quote, "This is the way your gentlemen behave. They make a disturbance over all my country, plunder the people, injure and disgrace my servants. They forcibly take away the goods and commodities of the peasants, merchants, etc., for the fourth part of their value, and by ways of violence and oppressions, they oblige the peasants to give 5 rupees for goods which are worth but 1 rupee." 7 decades later, one of Britain's greatest historians, Lord Macaulay, confirmed Mir Qasim's testimony regarding corruption of British rule. In his essay on Clive, Macaulay wrote that the British East India Company was a gang of public robbers who had spread terror through the whole plain of Bengal. Its governance was oppressive as the most oppressive form of barbarian despotism, strong with all the strength of civilization. It resembled the government of evil genii rather than the government of human tyrants. British Parliament denounced Clive as a corrupt Nawab. He was succeeded by Governor General Warren Hastings, who expanded the British rule in India. Hastings too was tried for corruption. During his trial, Edmund Burke, known as the father of modern conservatism, perceptively identified a root of the company's corruption. Accusing the British East India Company, Burke said, "These gentlemen have formed a plan of geographical morality, by which the duties of men in public and private situations are not to be governed by their relations to the great governor of the universe or by their relations to men, but by climates, degrees of longitude and latitude, as if when you have crossed the equinoctial line, all the virtues die, as if there were a kind of baptism, like that practiced by seamen, by which they unbaptize themselves of all that they learned in Europe and commence a new order and system of things." Burke's charge was that in India, the corrupt East India Company was practicing a geographical, that is, relative morality, which was not governed by God's moral absolutes. God's great command is that we must love, not loot his children, our neighbors as ourselves. In his influential work, The Men Who Ruled India, Philip Mason points out that this moral relativism was justified to maintain the British rule and trade in India. Trade interests overruled God's moral law. The company presumed that to be fair to Indians was to be prejudiced against the English. Burke's accusation, confirmed by the evangelical Christian Charles Grant and others, inspired British evangelicals to reform the British company. The Anglican evangelicals were just emerging out of the Wesleyan revival of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. They were called evangelicals because they had individually repented of their sins and had asked the Lord Jesus Christ to become their savior. They used to be moral rebels, sinners. Now they had repented and were reconciled to their Father. They dedicated their lives to ensure that God's will is done in their lives and in his world. Historian Ian Bradley explains their worldview and mission in his book, A Call to Seriousness, The Evangelical Impact on the Victorians. The great obstacle, quote, "the great obstacle to missionary endeavor in India at the beginning of the 19th century arose from the East India Company's conviction that missionaries would only excite the natives and disturb its profitable trading activities. Because of this, it refused them entry into the subcontinent. In this situation, there was only one thing for evangelicals to do if they wanted to secure the triumph of vital religion in India, and that was to infiltrate the higher echelons of the company themselves so that they could change its policy. Their takeover of the company's directorate in the early 19th century was spectacular. There was no year between 1807 and 1830 when either the chairman or the deputy chairman of the board of directors was not an evangelical, end quote. Charles Simeon, an Anglican priest in Cambridge, is considered the father of British evangelicalism. He responded to the East India Company's corruption by mentoring Cambridge students to go to India as missionaries. They had to be smuggled into India as undercover missionaries because in 1793, the British Parliament had rejected the Evangelical Bill to allow missionary educators into Bengal. The most famous of these was Henry Martyn, who lived in Kanpur and created literary Urdu through his translation of the New Testament. His Urdu replaced Mughal Persian as the court language of northern provinces, including Pakistan. His Urdu became the model for the development of the Hindi language. Reverend Claudius Buchanan was Charles Simeon's other well-known protege. He shared the Bible-derived evangelical conviction that British rule in India was not an accident of history. It was God's providential act. Buchanan saw it as his duty to reform the company rule by training the young men recruited to govern India. They needed to be trained spiritually, morally, and intellectually to know God's will and put it above their self-interest and company profits. Edmund Burke had already lamented that the company was taking to India the dregs of British society who had nothing to gain by remaining in Britain and much to gain by looting India, if they could survive the climate and tropical diseases. Buchanan decided to challenge British evangelicals to send their sons to govern India. For this reason, he traveled, lectured, and organized essay writing competitions in the 7 Irish, Scottish, and English universities and colleges. The topic was, how can Britain give good governance to India? As a Cambridge student, Thomas Babington Macaulay was one of the winners of these competitions. He is famous for his 1835 Minute on Education and as the creator of the Indian Penal Code. We discussed these in other sessions. First, in 1833 and then during 1852 to 56, Macaulay played an important role in laying the foundations of the university movement in India, opening the doors for Indians to become civil servants and for ensuring that civil servants were recruited strictly on merit and not because of nepotism or bribes. Transforming the moral character of the company's governance required Reverend Buchanan to change the outlook of British thought leaders and policy makers. In 1805, he challenged the idea that separation of church and state meant separating business and governance from God's moral law. His memoir on the wisdom of establishing a church in British India became the rationale for establishing the Anglican Church in India. An immediate need, argued Buchanan, was to meet the spiritual needs of the British in South Asia. The long-term effect of his proposal would make the church, not the company, a foundation for educating and civilizing the natives. Buchanan's memoir became an intellectual foundation for the Anglican evangelical engagement with India, supporting the spiritual growth of the company's employees and building high-quality institutions for educating and healing Indians. The first part of Buchanan's memoir dealt directly with the moral degeneration of the British rule in India and emphasized the necessity for a formal Anglican presence to minister to the Europeans in India. Charles Grant had already pointed out the need for moral reformation in his 1792 book, Observations on the State of Society Among the Asiatic Subjects of Great Britain. Buchanan went on to make practical suggestions on what the church must do. His case was strongly supported by Lord Teignmouth, who served as the Governor General of Bengal from 1793 to 1798. He wrote, "Considerations on the practicability, policy, and obligation of communicating to the natives of India the knowledge of the Christian religion, of Christianity." His arguments, along with those of Buchanan and Grant, exposed the hollow prejudice of the critics who believed that missionary-minded evangelicals were religious fanatics who should not intervene in politics. Readers of these books were able to see that the evangelicals had a better understanding of the British Empire. In their biblical view of governance, the ruler and the ruled needed to interact at a level deeper than mere commercialism. Israel's most famous king, David, composed the Psalms that shaped his people's worldview. David also laid the material and spiritual foundations of the temple that became the center of Judaism. The evangelicals viewed this relationship in the light of the Bible's teaching on covenant between the rulers and the ruled. This political theology, first articulated by the French Calvinists called the Huguenots, in 1570s became the foundation of the Scottish Reformation and democracy. Their relationship was providential, bound with moral obligations. Relativistic geographical morality needed to be replaced by godly governance. God's Ten Commandments had not purely localized application for ancient Israel. They were binding upon the company, which must not be allowed to govern as a gang of public robbers. Thomas Gisborne, an Anglican priest and member of the evangelical Clapham sect, went further in challenging the entitlement mentality that pervaded civil services, even in Britain. In 1795, he wrote what became a textbook for civil servants, Enquiries into the Duties of Men. It was a handbook for men who aspired to various callings: pastor, politician, civil servant, armed personnel, lawyer, doctor, tradesman, etc. In his chapter on the duties of the executive officers of government, he gave a detailed treatment of the moral composition that ought to constitute a civil servant and the way in which he should conduct himself in given situations. Civil servants such as Sir James Stephen lived out these duties. His father, also named James Stephen, was also a member of the Clapham sect. Ian Bradley writes about Stephen Jr.'s impact on the British idea of civil service. Their job was to advise, not to make policies. Once statesmen had made a policy, the civil servant's duty was to implement it wholeheartedly. Quote, "It was he who created the two grades of mechanical and intellectual in the civil service and who formulated the modern concept of civil servants as anonymous purveyors of impartial and expert advice to ministers. You stand not in need of statesmen in disguise," he told the Royal Commission on the Civil Service in 1854, "but of intelligent, steady, methodical men of business." End quote. Claudius Buchanan served as the vice provost of Calcutta's Fort William College. It was founded in order to educate the officers of the Secretariat. For 3 years, they studied Indian history, law, Oriental languages, ethics, international law, and general history. Its education system was modeled along the lines of Oxford and Cambridge. It was not a commercial school that taught the art of governing. Its statutes were recorded by Andrew Mayhew, who served as the director of public instruction in central provinces of India. His evangelical worldview, shaped by the Bible, insisted that the living God governs the cosmos. Therefore, human governance was God's sacred trust given to his children, whom he called for that vocation. This Bible-inspired idea of trusteeship continued to shape the mindset of Indian leaders for 150 years. My undergraduate curriculum included Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of governance as trusteeship, but my professors never told us the source of Gandhi's philosophy. Mayhew, the director of public instruction, explains how British robbers were transformed into trustees when he writes, "The civil servants of the company, no longer the agents of a commercial concern, but guardians of a sacred trust, were to study the people and its languages, improve their morals, and fortify their minds by science and the classics. Here they would be guarded against temptation and corruption with which the nature of the climate and the peculiar depravity of the people of India will assail them. Then and only then will they learn to diffuse affluence, happiness, willing obedience, and grateful attachment over every district." British young men who aspired to become civil servants were schooled in these reforming ideas at Haileybury College outside of London. Who were these young men? Ian Bradley explains, "The civil servants of the latter part of the 19th century were predominantly from the middle class and often from evangelical backgrounds. They had been brought up at home and at school to the discipline of hard work and regularity. They regarded their job as a vocation. For them, public service was not simply a source of personal gratification or gain. It was a matter of absolute moral duty. In fashioning this ethic of public service, which made British administration the envy of the world, the evangelicals had played no small part. The evangelical leadership in education made it much more than training in leadership skills. It refined the character and cultivated personal integrity. These public servants became very different from the British rulers in the 18th century. They began to be noticed as men of upright conduct and benefactors of the public. They were revered not for brutality, but for their intolerance for corruption, for upholding the rule of law over autocratic dispensation of power at the hands of rulers, for being concerned about matters of justice and mercy, and successfully installing infrastructure for the benefit of the governed. In conclusion, the growing, unabashed corruption of contemporary civil services should make us inquire what reformed the corrupt company that ruled and taxed vast amounts of land across India. The straight answer is the Bible. The British civil servants had governed a people who did not speak Sanskrit, Arabic, or Persian. They spoke vernaculars which had no grammar, textbook, and literature. How could civil servants learn languages of the people they were called to serve? To solve that problem, the college that trained them in Calcutta became the Center for Bible Translation. Missionary linguists such as William Carey teamed up with Indian teachers to translate the Bible into Indian languages. Later, the responsibility for translating the Bibles was handed over to the British and Foreign Bible Society. Its founders included some of the governors of the East India Company who wanted to reform the company and the British Raj. Most of these vernacular Bibles were printed at the Mission Press in Serampore. Aspiring civil servants studied vernacular Bibles to learn Indian languages, and in the process, they also learned how God wanted to be governed. Corruption is growing in many parts of the world. The good news is that corruption can be and has been cured substantially. Nations such as India need the humility to once again learn the spiritual secret of transforming the depravity of the human heart and governance. Here ends the reading. So that was the script that Dr. Mangalwadi presented in Oxford, or an edited version of the script. Before we go on, I do want to mention that I'm just the presenter. I did contribute to some of this research, but Dr. Mangalwadi and my wife, who's sitting right next to me, they were also contributors majorly to this research. Now, I don't know how much time we have, and if I'm in a position to.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Half an hour.
Okay, so so much of what I wanted to share already has been covered in the reading. Still, I will just go over the reading, just in simple words, try to summarize all that was said. Just in terms of governance, I was reading this book by Deepak Gupta, who was the president of the UPSC. He's written on the history of the civil services, and he mentions how in ancient India, people praised Indian administration. He quotes Megasthenes, a Greek historian who visited the Mauryan Empire, and he says that he found that Indians were law-abiding citizens and that crime was rare. I tried to track down that quote, and it says simply there that he visited only Patliputra, the capital of the Mauryan Empire, and there it simply says that theft was low and that people's laws were simple. They didn't have any written codes. They just took each other for word of mouth. And so that is being interpreted in his book, and not just in his book, but even in NCRT. And this is kind of like, if you're preparing for the civil services, like this is one of the things you learn is like Megasthenes, Megasthenes did praise Indian administration. But the same Megasthenes, a few pages later, mentions polygamy. He mentions how women were being taken, multiple women were being taken in marriage, and they would prostitute themselves unless compelled to be chaste. And that if anyone broke their word, gave false testimony, that their fingers would be cut off. So this is this kind of weird sense of justice, peculiar sense of justice, and moral, not the kind of moral law that the modern world is built around. It's not a rule of law. And truly, we see that in actuality, in all of history, kings have been in charge of setting up moral law. Rule of law is a particularly Christian development, a Protestant development in the history of the Christian Church, and that is what we have inherited in India. Um, it, and that book, by Deepak Gupta, also mentions how the Mughals, it is some semblance of governance was there by the Mughals, that they set up a kind of feudal system, but that was very severe depending on the king. Again, rule was not based on law; it was based on whoever was in power, and that was floundering after King Aurangzeb, and this kind of power vacuum that the Mughals had left inevitably brought the British into power. The British didn't. It says that the British didn't want to be in power. They just found themselves in power and began to rule India in Bengal and then Madras and in Bombay. But and they were just given this responsibility to rule India. That reminds me, one of my spiritual mentors, Robin Patrick, he would ask me, what if today the government of India is submitted to the Muslim community in India? Would they be able to run the country? And I thought about it and I said, yes. And he was like, yes, you're right. They have infrastructure, they have politicians, they have flourishing institutions, educational institutions, they have people with funding. They have people who are willing to actually sacrifice for the cause of their community, right? And then he asked me, if the Christians in India are given the responsibility to run India today, will they be able to run India? And my response was, I don't think so. And he was like, I'm right. You're right. Indian Christians may not know how to run. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have the wherewithal or just the drive to rule. But the British did. And that was because they were influenced by the gospel for centuries, that had shaped them for years. But as they did come to it, they were corrupt, as we read in the paper. They were paid very less by the East India Company, those that were sent as civil servants, civil in contrast with military. So whoever was in charge of trading activities, that was a civil servant. But these were corrupt because they were paid very less by the company. So they started doing private trade and started profiting off and extorting. It was a kind of monopoly that they had over trade, right? So they just would scam and loot Indians. That's what we read in large part of the paper. But because Britain is part of the Indian Christian, it receives Christian Protestant principles. They had the stream of Protestant Christianity in them. There was the stream of reform that Britain itself introduced. Many people don't like to acknowledge that. They try to pose everything as a race question these days. Everything is about how the white man felt himself racially superior to the Eastern man. Western man called himself superior. But in my understanding, the true dividing line is not West and East, it's Christian and non-Christian. If they were a sensible Christian British person, he would say that they would admit that we were barbarians just as people in India are, and it's the gospel and it's Christianity, it's development in civilization that has grown us as a community, as a covenanted body under God, right? And so they sought for reform. Even those that were not Christian sought for reform, because that is the spirit of Protestant Christianity that ruled Britain. But because of John Wesley and because of the revival, they brought about a reformation. Many of the quotes that I wanted to share have already been shared, but let me jump forward so I can share this particular quote. As we read about education, that more and more evangelicals were impacting India, they understood the importance of education in training Indians to become rulers. And I would just like to quote Alexander Duff here, who was not quoted in the who was not quoted in the presentation. So that is something different from what was shared so far. Alexander Duff recognized that this education must be Christian education. And he said, if you want good governance, like if you want to reform India and you think that only like if you do brutal, like blatant good governance, that's not going to work. There's something prior to that that needs to happen. Let me just read this quote. This is from Alexander Duff's work, India and India Missions. Those who attribute most of the evils to the influence of a grinding despotism tell us that the establishment of a representative government and free institutions, the investiture of the great body of the people with municipal rights and political privileges, would, by achieving their emancipation from a tyrannical yoke, raise them in the scale of civilization, comfort, and earthly felicity. What enlightened mind is not ready to acknowledge that such a government and institutions, such rights and privileges, to be among the greatest of temporal blessings and productive of the great temporal good? Oh, sorry, this went back. But does not all experience prove that these must be the effects, the results of something antecedent, before they can become the causes of any real and lasting consequent good? For what are the institutions and privileges in question? What but the visible forms in which certain previously excogitated opinions and cherished principles are embodied? What but the external organs for the full manifestation and development of these principles and opinions? To attempt, therefore, to regenerate a people by bestowing upon them free institutions at the very outset, when as yet they are literally steeped in the very slough of bondage, intellectual, moral, and religious, individual, social, and political, is surely to begin at the wrong end. First, imbue the mind of an enslaved people with the true spirit, the true genius, the true sentiment of rational freedom, and these will speedily manifest their inherent power by shaking off, like old-fashioned and worn-out garments, the positive forms and organs of an oppressive despotism, and at once and at the same time clothing themselves in the representative forms and developing themselves through the congenial organs of a free constitution with its equitable sanctions, rights, privileges, and laws. So here, Duff is saying that the beginning of good governance is pre-political. It starts with governance. True governance begins before policy. And for that, you need particularly Christian education. You need to train people in the scriptures. You need to train people in the laws and build moral governance. Scripture teaches us that we are slaves to something. We are either slaves to God or we're slaves to men. And what scripture brings us to, what the gospel brings us to, is freedom out from slavery to men. And we free ourselves so that we can rule and so that we can bless and seek justice. And so as people prepare for civil services in India, even today, and as India becomes more and more Christian, we should expect and we should pray for self-governance. We should pray that we are able to rule ourselves well, that we are able to rule our institutions well, that we are able to rule our households well. For it says in scripture that, for qualifications for a pastor, it says, let his children be, not disorderly. Let him rule himself well, for if he does not rule his household well, how will he rule the church of God? And so all of this begins with self-governance under God's word. And then God gives us more responsibility. He is faithful in little, will be faithful in much. So God gives us more and more. So as India becomes more and more Christian, as the gospel goes out, we should expect, yearn, and pray for good governance through Christian principles, through the Holy Spirit. So I think that should be all that I would like to share. I'm happy to have any questions. I'm sure Dr. Vishal will be happy to answer anything I'm not able to answer, or other wise people here.
Yes, thank you, Samuel, for elaborating on the script and adding more points to it, adding more quotes. Can you? What was the book you quoted from? The some of these quotes you showed in the last slides.
Yes, absolutely. I would be happy to share the quotes. India and India Missions is the name of the book. I will just share my screen again. It's in the bottom of the screen.
What year was it published?
I think 1835 or 1836. 1839, I'm sorry. Oh, not this one. My page is not running anyway. India and India Missions. This was by Alexander Duff, who was a Scottish Presbyterian missionary. He had gone back to Scotland to give a presentation on the work that he had been doing and encourage more missionaries. And he has this chapter in that book that gospel is the only effective means to regenerate the people of India. This is from that chapter, chapter 4.
Wow. So there was a book written in 1830s, right?
1839, yeah.
Yes, 1339, yes. It's almost 200 years now, right? Close to 200
That's
years.
right.
Yeah.
I'll post the link to the book also in the chat.
Yeah, this is, yeah. I mean, Dr. Vishal has also quoted, but this is amazing that, something almost 200 years back, people still don't believe that, the Bible discipled modern India to a great extent, not to a whole extent, but yes, there was a, and this book is, this book here available publicly in archives.com, archive.org is, right there. So
yeah, it's in the government of India library. That's where the book is.
Right. So yes. So yeah. So what any questions or comments from anybody? If not, I mean, just to come back to that topic uh, of how people are, children in India or the young people in India are preparing for civil services, right? That is their, most one of the most, wanted jobs, or like the priced job today in the job market, because but I mean today, if you talk to any of these aspiring civil servants, right? Um, what what drives them? What have you talked to some of them? Do you know?
Yeah.
I think you
I
yourselves were one, right? At one point,
no.
or
I
you were not
never
prepared.
sought civil service myself, but I studied at St. Stephen's College, where every second person wants to do civil services. So I have many friends who have become civil servants. maybe one or two of them, even Christians. But I think what drives people, so this machinery, which was set up to free India, I think now exists in that same form of slavery almost, like uh, there's like lakhs of students just blindly running after these 700 jobs, right? Like we are still seeking jobs instead of creating jobs, right? Like we are not thinking as free individuals, I think. So I'm not saying it's wrong to seek civil service. It is of course like still like a major part of Indian governance. But like times are changing. There's so much that we can do. There's so many jobs, not just jobs, but there's so much that can be done. Dhruv Rathi, probably not many people follow him, but he talks about, he's in Germany, so he's seen the Western world and recognizes that people here are, they're throwing themselves into things and making money. They're good enough to make money out of whatever they are doing, right?
Yeah,
But
right. Yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to ask you
mhm,
is if any of these people who had,
mhm.
was preparing for civil service had read or heard of any of these people, Alexander
No,
Duff, India and Indian missions,
no, no,
some
no.
of these foundational texts which
Mhm.
actually,
I
made
think it's
modern
very,
India.
yeah, it's again self-serving. Most people are going into civil services because it's a cushy job. I don't think they, I don't think they really want to serve anyone. So they're acting like 17th, 18th century, like, those looters,
Right.
and not thinking freely for themselves, as Christians are called to do.
Yes, Brother Ashish, Dr. Ashish, Alexander. Yes.
Yeah, very nice, Sam. Really enjoyed. Yeah, Uh, yeah, very well done, and really enjoyed all that you added later, particularly by Alexander Duff and Arthur Mayhew. Um, it's very interesting, I think, what you said very categorically that one of the divisions that have to be made is not really Western and non-Western, but Christian and not Christian. Uh, that's a very important point. I'll come back to that later, but the first thing that I want to share with everyone here is that uh, time and again there are a lot of people, particularly among Christians, who come and say that people should uh, try for civil services. Our young people should aspire to become civil servants. One thing which I think uh, needs to be understood is that when any civil servant is planning, or any aspirant is planning to be a civil servant and preparing for civil services, the question is what kind of books is he reading? Now, if your perspective is the same as what you have mentioned about Deepak Gupta, then even if you become a civil servant, your thinking hasn't really changed. Your perspective hasn't changed. You haven't really begun to believe that it's the gospel that has changed India. So I think sometimes we unfairly push our young people to excel in civil services without providing them with the adequate material. So that is one thing. We need to build a base of knowledge on the basis of which our young people can prepare themselves for service. You know, uh, that's one thing. I think the mindset, the worldview has to be changed. It is not enough to become a civil servant. I think we have to become civil servants with the heart of the servant king. The servant leadership has to come, and that will only come when we rewrite our history uh, the way we want to, from the gospel and the providential and from the biblical perspective, something that we are planning to do and trying to do through these Thursday meetings. So it's basically revolutionizing our our our, our knowledge systems also. So that is one thing that I want to say. The second thing is, of course, that the administrators have to be Christians. That's very important point, which is a historical experience of India. Now, what was happening, many of these people who were governing India or being civil servants, uh, they were shaped by the biblical ideas and biblical worldview. The problem was that many of the subordinates were not. So even though the top bosses or the top civil servants may have been, the district collector may have been shaped by the Christian worldview, but many of his subordinates, because many of them were actually Indians, and they did not share that worldview. So corruption, exploitation continued for a very long time. And later, when ICS, disappeared and IAS replaced it, that rot began to increase. So some of the earliest IAS officers who actually were trained in the ICS mold, they uh, they still had those ethos and they still served righteously, but I think the rot set in because the biblical worldview, uh, it kept fading away. So that's one of that has been one of our problems. uh, I'm reminded of Jyotirao Phule in his book Gulamgiri, or Slavery. Towards the end of that book, he writes to the British administrators, the British Raj, that you must send Christian pastors as the revenue collectors in our villages, because the Kulkarnis, the upper caste uh, revenue collectors, they are cheating us, the Shudras, the Bahujans, the untouchables. They are being and they are fleeced. They are they are duped and deceived by these upper caste managers who are there. So he actually wanted Christian pastors. He categorically says the padres should be part of the governance system. So that was another important thing. So yeah, so these two things I think are important. One is uh, the fading of the Christian worldview, and also the historical experience of Christian administrators. I think that has to that has to be given a serious thought by all of us. So thank you once again, and I'm inspired. I would like to study more of this, and yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, sister. Thank you, Dr. Ashish. Sister Priyadarshini Gandhi has.
Hi, good evening. I've been a civil servant, not because I studied in the IAS, but I became a technocrat and was brought into the bureaucracy about 12 years ago. So I worked with the central government, and I found that people of the age of who are in their 70s now, most of them Stephanians, who were taught in convent schools, have maintained a huge degree of ethics in their way of functioning. But the people who've come in now, as in our juniors, people who've walked into the IAS, IRS, IPS post 1990, their level of virtues and moral values is way diminished. And that is also because I noticed that a lot of my colleagues and my seniors were all taught in convent schools, and we had moral science as a very important subject. So whether we studied in Doon, Mayo, Sindhya School, not Sindhya, sorry, the one in Delhi College in Indore, and Loyola, and whatever else various other institutes in UP, Uttar Pradesh, La Martiniere, Lucknow, La Martiniere, Calcutta, Weinberg Allen, and various others. So everybody had a very high degree of morality, and they were very uneasy about doing anything wrong. But the people today that you find, there is a nexus where the senior teaches the junior how to be corrupt. So the senior is actually tying up with the junior because the file is passed from the lowermost staff in that department, that is the new entrant, to the highest level. So whether it goes from the director to the joint director, to the senior director, to the additional director general, joint director general, chief secretary, XYZ. So now money is not made by one person, it is actually en bloc. And then there is a system where everybody saves everybody else, because there is an internal audit that is done, a kind of a auditor general, but who's part of the IS, who's also part of the entire nexus. And everybody is now making money, and it's not about one person making money, it's about a whole group of people making money. So if you have to lobby to get any project done, whether you're a businessman or whether you're a mafia or whether you've committed a severe crime and you want to get, or you want to take away somebody's land, they tie up right from the patwari level, that is at the lowermost level in the revenue courts, right up to the financial commissioner. Now, even if the financial commissioner is in his 60s and therefore was brought up in a convent school and was honest, if the DC and below have a nexus, like for example, I meet a lot of heads of police in different states who say that the upper echelons of the police don't really get into a lot of corruption, but the lower level staff from who have been inducted laterally from DANIBS or from CRPF or wherever else, they do a lot of corruption. So they do a lot of extortion. So there's a whole system of extortion that is working out. Definitely, I'm very happy to have heard what the Professor Doc Vishal has set up. I mean, this is my first time on a Thursday Zoom meeting. And yes, that is true that I think that if I was to look back at all my colleagues who were honest and maintained a very high degree of morality and refused to take even a penny, and who kind of retired without much of an income, and just had their pensions and their medical care, and then shifted to outer parts of Delhi or couldn't even live in Delhi anymore and have therefore gone to smaller places to live in, they didn't and weren't corrupt. But the new group of people who are now in their 40s and 50s, I mean, entering their 50s, they are wholly corrupt, and they're able to buy bungalows in the best parts of wherever they want to live. And they say that, okay, we need. However, conversely, I also met two Syrian Christians who were very senior. One of them became a chief secretary. I will not mention his name, but he was actually indicted in two major cases of corruption, and he is a Christian. He's a believing Christian, goes to church, and he was fully corrupt. So obviously, I think the heart of Jesus didn't enter his heart and his mind, and he was just as corrupt as anybody else could be. And I think he retired a few years ago, so he would be one of our generation, senior to us. so so I think that to find a solution for this is very imperative, because India has become even more corrupt in the past 5 years. I've noticed now we have lawyers who are lobbying, who are lobbyists, who are actually just earning money not by practicing law, but you go to them to negotiate a deal so that you make the payments, and your case gets cleared by the judges, and the judges and the lawyers have a nexus, and the politicians too. And so it's a huge extortion racket that is being played out in civil society under the noses of everybody else. And then there are NGOs who actually support this, certain NGOs. So it's a full nexus, and it has to be broken. And it needs not only a reformation, it needs a revolution that will lead to a reformation. And so yes, so this is my feedback on what is happening with the bureaucracy. In fact, one of my friends who's also Stephanian, who just retired, he's written a book on why the bureaucracy is corrupt and what can be done about it. But I think that is more of a secular viewpoint, and um, not a Christian viewpoint. Though he is very deeply affected by Christian values, he was brought up in La Martiniere in Calcutta, and then came to Stephens. And I remember that at the assembly in the morning in Stephen, everyone used to have the morning prayers, and we had so many professors who were very who for whom ethics formed a very great part of imparting, whether it was physics or maths or even history and economics. Ethics formed a very big part of the curriculum, and it isn't so anymore. The people who are now joining the IAS, whether it is through reservation or through any other form, are from mostly very very different institutions, who don't care a hoot about any form of ethics, and it is whatever you can grab, and that's your right because the world has treated you unfairly. So that sort of system is playing about now. And people, in fact, it is surprising that just before retirement the officer does as many big projects as he can, whether he's a judge or a bureaucrat, so that he can make his money for retirement. And the whole system is so accepted that it's actually it's as if it's the done thing and not something to be horrified about. And yes, there is a solution needed, a very urgent solution, because it has deteriorated to such an extent in the past 5 years. I mean, till 2019 it was that, oh gosh, people were horrified about corruption. After 2019, corruption has become even more institutionalized to such an extent that I meet highly educated people who tell me, look, the only way out is for you to work on this kind of system. Go to X person, get the negotiation done, and if you don't have the money, you can't get it done. So that's where the system is right now.
Yes, thank you, sister, for your comments. There is one more person who has raised his hand, but in the meantime, Brother Abel, please hold on while Dr. Vishal, if you would like to make a comment, or maybe Dr. Abel would like to speak, and then.
I'd just like to
Yeah,
make
sure,
a small
sure.
relation that the British Empire, that is an imperialist regime. And so the company, 1852, the company that is directly on the board of directors, directly ruling over the Indian civil services, and they administer. So,
Can you speak a little bit more
like
clearly,
India is
or?
found in a democracy. And in a democracy, we have a whole system where the real power is not with the IAS or the executive. The real power is with the political parties that people elect. And at least on theory, that is how it is. And so, how do we make things work? Because the political parties, different political parties have different ideologies. We're currently under a kind of a regime which is very fascist and extreme right. And so, what are the if you are going to be a morally upright IAS officer who is going to serve as a bureaucrat, you're not having the power to invent policy. You're not having the power to have your own ideologies. So ideology is also not in your hand, and so from that policy making is also not in your hand. Lawmaking as an MP, these are the things that are important in a democracy, and the local MLA is more important than the collector or the sub-collector in a place. Yeah. So the real power is in the hands of the people, and so to talk about IAS officers as continuing from the ICS is to miss the point that structurally India is a democracy and not an imperialist regime anymore. And so, although the ICS is directly handed over as the IAS for very various reasons that I don't want to mention now, and the police system also, it is a kind of imperialistic regime where the British are no more the imperialists, colonizers, but another group of so-called autonomous people. They are the colonizers, and the same regime is going on, and it is very convenient for the ICS to be followed as the IAS and the police system all to be adopted. A lot of research has established this thing. What is the possibility that becoming an IAS officer was offering a very clean or non-corrupt, honest administration going to do? It's actually going to follow the regime's dictates very clearly and pass it on to the people. And so the regime is going to have its ideology is going to be very oppressive and evil. Then the conduit of the bureaucracy is going to be an honest officer and very conformist to that thing. It's just going to deliver the policy and the anti-people oppressive agenda right onto the people. So I think there is a problem here on just bring to light the problem that the polity and involvement in that in a democracy must be understood as something where it is not the bureaucracy or the IAS which is the area of focus, but it is the elected representatives from from the local councillors to the MLAs to the MPs and to the ministers and the cabinet, and that's where the Christian presence must be found, either in a capacity to rule or in counter hegemonic formations where you form a good opposition in civil society as well as in electoral politics. And ignoring that, we just focus on reduce the issue of bureaucracy and administration, also flatten it to a moral issue of honesty or corruption. And that is also going to be a very, let us say, with blinders on kind of understanding of what it takes to regenerate India going forward. Thank you very much.
Yes, Dr. Vishal, the spotlight is on you. Yes. You're muted. You're muted.
Thank you, Brother Abel Raj and Priyadarshini. And thank you, Samuel Davidson. We haven't seen your wife sitting next to you, but in the original paper, which will be published in the volumes on the 3 volumes on the Bible. Hi, Shita. I was confused. When is your baby due?
In March.
Okay, I thought the baby has already come. But that's Naveena's baby is here, which is Prashant's wife. But thank you. So Ishita had also researched this paper, which will be published. The script has my name because I'm playing the role of the anchor in those things. Different people have researched, like the show on Renaissance languages. Dr. Ashish Alexander, who was there with me in Oxford, he wrote the draft. Marcia, who is online with us, she wrote the draft on emancipation of women, how the Bible empowered women in India. And Blesson, who is not with us, he did a lot of research and wrote the draft of the script for the Bible's impact on transforming Indian agriculture, of how India became a food exporting country. So I'm very grateful. It's like you have television anchors, they don't actually research and write what they present, but they do have to tell their name that this is my name, this is who I am. And they're taking responsibility for the research that has been done. So the chapter will not have my name. The chapter will have the name of Samuel and Ishita. But once again, just to thank you for the future to develop. I will give both a practical strategy in a moment of what needs to happen, but 2 comments. One, although a lot of the books that we have quoted and referred to are coming from a British colonial period, Britain itself got a concept of civil service from Germany. So here is a book. I don't see myself in the camera is full. Okay, Out of Revolution by Eugene Rochenstock Hussey. It's a massive book. He's a meta-historian, a German from a Jewish background. He pointed out how the Reformation in Germany in the 16th century created the modern concept of civil service. I won't summarize his thesis, but that is what traveled to England, and Britain became greater than Holland and all the other European countries in the 19th century because the British civil services were changed. Now, incidentally, the idea of electing civil servants on merit rather than nepotism and bribery that first developed in India. So Alexander Duff, Lord Macaulay, Charles Trevelyan, these people were back in England in 1852-53, when 53 charter was being reviewed. And by that time, they were very upset. Macaulay was very upset that there was not a single Indian civil servant in ICS, because in 1833, when Macaulay was in Parliament, they had already argued that Indians must be recruited to Indian civil services. But for 20 years, not a single Indian was recruited. Why not? The answer was because India does not have universities. There are no university graduates. There are Christian colleges, many of them started by Alexander Duff himself, including Madras Christian College was inspired by Duff, and the Wilson College, etc. These were the impact of Scottish Reformation channeled through Alexander Duff. But after 53, the question that, okay, if you're not recruiting Indians into Indian civil services because there are no university graduates in India, give them university. That's how the Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay universities were born as a result of the educational dispatch of Charles Wood. All of these were evangelical movements. So the universities were created, and St. Stephen's College continues to do that, to provide civil services to India. Now, one of the contribution that Samuel and Ishita have made is the, which I hadn't read before, is the contribution of the book, the emphasis of Claudius Buchanan, that India needs a church. It's not enough to have a company, to have merchants, to have military. These institutions of military and merchants, they're not going to educate India. You have to have the church, which will, we've trained a civil servant for 3 years in Fort William College, but who is going to look after his spiritual life, his moral life, once he's out of his college? That's where you need an ongoing religious community, the church. And that was his argument, which Samuel has quoted in the full paper. The script is in a shorter version because the word limit was 2,500, which Oxford, the people who were filming, John Lennox group, they had put the limit to 2,500. They gave me the freedom to go up to 3,000 words, but we had to cut down a lot of the research that Ishita and Samuel had done. So that's why many of the quotations did not get included in it, but they will be there in the full chapter. My two practical suggestions, having given you this little background of the script. One is that many of the problems of corruption within the civil service, the corruption and political world, which Abel has pointed out, is legitimate and clear. But today our focus is on civil service, and it is very great to have Priyadarshini with us today, because it is her great-grandfather, Pandit Nehru, who was misled by the Cambridge University and Western universities, thinking that secular humanism and socialism can provide morally upright governance to India. So the Nehru's socialism, and he is Priyadarshini's great-grandfather, for those who do not know, socialism rapidly increased the number of recruits to the Indian civil services, because now the government is going to do everything. And if government is doing everything, it needs lots of civil servants, and you do not have the time in the college. Coaching classes are not the coaching classes that are preparing students for civil services, they cannot shape the character of those students. And this is where Claudius Buchanan's argument that you need the church to shape the moral character, not only before the students become civil servants, but particularly after they become civil servants. So that point which Philip Messon and others have made, that Ian Bradley, that the civil servants who gave clean government to India were sons, a second or third son of poor pastors. The families were praying for their moral integrity. The church was praying that they will give good, honest government to India. They had that moral environment around them, which was very necessary. So the reform of the church is very corrupt. Many bishops have gone to jail. Many more should go to jail. The church needs reform. But at the moment, I think my first practical suggestion is that if we ask Priyadarshini to create a book on how corruption was actually cured and why corruption has come back in a big way in India, if Samuel and Ishita supported her and a book came out from her, she would be the powerful voice for the nation. If she wrote a book on that, even Rahul and Priyanka and Varun Gandhi, all her cousins, would have to listen to what she's saying. So that's my first practical suggestion. But the long-term practical suggestion is that we need to create an online curriculum for preparing for UPSC exams, which will begin with students who are in going in 8th class. So if parents begin to encourage their children that, hey, look, you have to grow up to be a leader, and you enroll yourself in this course, which is online, but will be offered through local churches. So every church would encourage young people to consider serving the nation and get enrolled in this course, which is training leaders for political purposes, for business and innovation, to be scientists, etc., but also to become civil servants at various levels. So by the time these students come into 12th grade, they should be studying, because UPSC curriculum is actually, except for the one on contemporary subjects, current affairs, all of the UPSC curriculum is in fact intermediate level curriculum, which is 12th grade. What you have studied in 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, that is the questions that come in UPSC exams. So we create a curriculum online, make it available to every church. RSS is doing it. Zamia Millia is doing it. They're training students to become civil servants. But the church is not doing it. And this is because of the corruption of Christian theology, corruption of evangelical theology. And I have said these things harshly a few times. To repeat it again, just 3-4 years ago, some students, some graduates in Andhra AGF graduates who were already leading Bible studies in Andhra Pradesh or Telangana in different colleges, they decided to prepare for UPSC exam. And Andhra AGF said that this has changed, incidentally, thankfully, and because of John Samuel and others, but this is 4 years ago. This was the evangelical mindset in India, that the EGF in Andhra Pradesh said that if you are going to prepare for UPSC exams, you are not allowed to teach the Bible to university students in Andhra. This is before Andhra and Telangana were split. So this is the terrible theological mindset of the evangelical movement today, which is a corruption that has come from American theology. And most of our seminaries have been infected by this American evangelical virus, which is opposite to what the British evangelicals had done in India, in the Victorian evangelicals. And that is what this paper is highlighting. So as we recover the biblical spirituality, which created British civil service and Indian civil service, and the point I was making was that the idea of UPSC, the merit, that only on merit, not on the basis of nepotism and corruption, somebody should become a civil servant. This was first accepted in India because of Macaulay Duff Trevelyan. And then 6 months later, Britain was changed, and Britain decided that civil servants will be appointed on the basis of merit, not on the basis of nepotism and connections. So that the UPSC actually led the whole world in, at that time it was not called UPSC, but it led the whole world, including Britain, in reforming civil services. So I'm proposing two practical suggestions that we should support Priyadarshini to create a book that the nation will listen on what has happened to civil services, but why this degeneration has set in. And in one of my letters to Arun Shourie, I've gone into the history of what had happened to civil servants, Mansabdars, during the Mughal Empire, which Abel referred to. But today is not the time to go back and visit that. So what happened during the British era is what we've discussed now. What happened to the civil services in India before the church began to reform Indian civil services. But then to actually implement this vision, we have to we have to turn every church into a place where 2-3 young people can go and begin to prepare to become civil servants. And this training should begin from 8th grade students and continue up to bachelor's level, because you cannot appear in interview for UPSC. You can do the written exam, but you can't enter for your interview unless you have a graduation degree with you. So by the time you have finished your BA, you are allowed to not only write the exam, UPSC exam, but also if you pass the written exam, you enter into you qualify for interviews. So India can be changed. Corruption has been successfully fought and eradicated from India, and corruption can once again be eradicated. It is the foolishness of evangelical theology, which says that no, the world is set to go from bad to worse. This fatalism of dispensationalism, that, Paul said that in the last days there will be terrible times and things will become morally from bad to worse. It is this pessimistic, fatalistic, evangelical theology that has to be transformed if India has to be transformed and if the church has to be mobilized. So I'll stop there, but take other question. I'm just expressing my gratitude for a number of people who had helped with the scripts they are now being edited and they will come out soon. Daniel Thomas, I say his name, he was critical. His help was critical in helping Ashish to come to Oxford. So thank you, Daniel.
Yes.